Elizabeth Wilson, the nurse carrying old wounds. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway of Mount Auburn Hospital on a chilly autumn evening, but today, they were quicker than usual. Elizabeth Wilson, a dedicated nurse with 7 years of experience, couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that had clung to her ever since receiving a message from her father. On the screen of her phone, the short yet weighty words stood out: "We're having a family meeting tomorrow. Kane will be there too." The name Kane, the older brother she hadn't seen in 3 years, made her chest tighten. A part of her still hadn't healed from the wounds of the past. But Elizabeth was not someone who let personal emotions interfere with her work. She took a deep breath, maintaining her usual composed demeanor. As she passed the nurse's station, an elderly patient greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Wilson, you look lovely today." Elizabeth returned the smile, tucking a strand of her long brown hair behind her ear. Her gestures were gentle, embodying the calmness of a nurse who had devoted years to her profession. Her deep brown eyes had always given her patients a sense of security, but today, there was a faint shadow lurking behind them. She sat in the break room, staring at her phone screen. Thoughts from the past rushed back like an unstoppable tide. 3 years ago, everything had changed too quickly. Back then, Elizabeth had been a woman who seemed to have it all: a devoted nurse, a loving wife to Michael, a highly respected and ambitious cardiologist. Their life together had appeared perfect: strolls along the Charles River, elegant dinners at their favorite Italian restaurant, the moment he had proposed to her by a window overlooking the crimson maple trees of Harvard Square. She had believed she was stepping into a lifetime of happiness. But those beautiful days hadn't lasted. When her mother fell seriously ill, Elizabeth poured all her time and energy into caring for her, balancing both her work and her duty as a daughter. She stayed late at the hospital, assisted with her mother's treatments, and held her hand through the pain. Meanwhile, Kane, her charming but superficial older brother, continued indulging in his luxurious lifestyle, throwing extravagant parties, taking long vacations, and flooding social media with glimpses of his wealth. Michael changed as well. His words became sharper, his patience thinner. "You don't have Kane's sense of style. As a nurse, you can't keep up with my social circle. I wish you had better taste, like Kane." Each comment felt like a knife to the heart. But Elizabeth endured, believing that love meant patience. Until that fateful night. After a long shift, she walked to the hospital parking lot, exhausted but eager to go home. That was when she saw them, Michael and Kane, embracing in the front seat of a luxury car. Kane's voice rang out, playful and taunting. "Oh my, have we been caught?" And Michael, the man she had once loved with all her heart, simply shrugged and said, "Well, it's over. Let's get divorced." Her world collapsed in that instant. But the nightmare didn't end there. After abandoning her, Michael demanded alimony, while Kane openly slandered her to their family. Even worse, she soon discovered that the money meant for their mother's care had been misused, spent on Kane's indulgences and Michael's extravagant lifestyle. Their mother's health rapidly declined, and in her final moments, she whispered a faint apology to Elizabeth, perhaps for the betrayal of those who should have cared for her the most. When their mother passed away, Kane didn't even show up to the funeral. That day, Elizabeth made a choice. She left her family home, cut off all ties, and moved into a small apartment close to the hospital. She focused solely on work, ignoring the constant stream of glamorous photos Kane continued to post online: European vacations, luxury cars, high-end restaurants. Occasionally, she would scroll past the comments, "What a perfect couple," and quietly move on. For 3 years, her only contact with her father had been through monthly phone calls and occasional birthday visits. He had once told her, "Focus on healing your heart for now." And she had obeyed. But now, her father had summoned a family meeting, and Kane had agreed without hesitation. It was suspicious. Within hours, Kane had booked a suite at a luxury hotel, and Michael had begun consulting lawyers. Clearly, they expected a discussion about inheritance. Outside the break room window, the Cambridge sky had turned a deep indigo, signaling the arrival of another cold autumn night. But inside Elizabeth, a storm was brewing. She didn't know what her father had planned, but she had a feeling that tomorrow's meeting would change everything. 3 years ago, Elizabeth Wilson's life was seemingly perfect: a loving marriage, a fulfilling career, and the belief that family was the cornerstone of her world. As a dedicated nurse at Mount Auburn Hospital, she had spent years caring for others, always placing their needs before her own. She had also been a devoted wife to Michael, a rising star in the cardiology department, and a proud sister to Kane, the charismatic, stylish older brother who had always been the center of attention. But as the autumn leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, Elizabeth's world began to unravel in ways she never could have imagined. It started subtly. Michael, once affectionate and attentive, began coming home later and later, often citing urgent surgeries or important meetings. The warm dinners Elizabeth prepared with love were met with indifference or outright criticism. "I wish we could eat at fancy restaurants like Kane does. As a nurse, you'll never understand my social circle. Kane has such great taste, don't you think?" The remarks stung, but Elizabeth brushed them aside, believing that all marriages had rough patches. She convinced herself that Michael was simply stressed from work, that he would eventually return to being the man who had once whispered loving words to her beneath the stars of Cape Cod. But the real cracks formed when her mother fell seriously ill. A woman of remarkable strength and kindness, their mother had battled rheumatoid arthritis for years, always putting her family before her own suffering. As her condition worsened, Elizabeth took on the responsibility of caring for her, balancing long shifts at the hospital with sleepless nights at her mother's bedside. She fed her, bathed her, repositioned her frail body to prevent bedsores, doing everything in her power to ease her pain. And yet, Kane was nowhere to be found. Elizabeth's brother, ever the socialite, claimed to be too busy with his high-end real estate business, flitting between elite parties and exotic vacations. While their mother lay in bed struggling to breathe, Kane was sipping champagne at five-star resorts, documenting his extravagant life through glossy Instagram posts. "I'll visit when I have time," he would text dismissively. But time never came. Michael, too, grew increasingly detached. He began criticizing her devotion to their mother, suggesting that she should just put her in a facility and move on. His frustration turned to neglect, then to resentment. "You spend more time with your mother than with me. You're letting this take over your life." And then, one night, everything shattered. Elizabeth had just finished an exhausting overtime shift and was heading to her car when she spotted two familiar figures in a sleek luxury vehicle. Under the dim glow of the parking lot lights, Michael and Kane sat close together, their laughter ringing through the cool autumn air. Kane's voice, smug and mocking, carried across the lot. "Oh my, have we been caught?" Michael didn't even flinch. Instead, he leaned back, arms crossed, and smirked. "Well, it's over. Let's get divorced." Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. The man she had loved, the brother she had once trusted, both had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. The days that followed were a blur of pain and humiliation. Michael demanded a hefty alimony, while Kane spread vicious lies, painting her as an ungrateful, bitter woman. Worse, Elizabeth discovered that the money meant for their mother's care had been siphoned off. Kane had been receiving thousands of dollars monthly, but not a single payment had reached the care facility. When their mother passed away shortly after, weakened by illness and heartbreak, Kane didn't even show up to the funeral. Elizabeth stood by her mother's grave alone, clutching her trembling hands together as the last vestiges of warmth left her body. That day, she made a decision she would walk away from the toxic ties that had strangled her for so long. She packed her belongings and moved into a small, modest apartment near the hospital. It was nothing luxurious, but it was hers. She worked long hours, filling her time with patients who needed her, finding solace in the quiet hum of the hospital's routine. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of Kane and Michael's extravagant lifestyle through social media: European getaways, designer suits, lavish parties. Their lives looked perfect to the outside world. But Elizabeth knew better. She knew the weight of the choices they had made, and deep down, she knew that no amount of money or luxury could erase the stain of their betrayal. Elizabeth Wilson sat in the back of a taxi, staring out the window as the familiar streets of Cambridge passed by. It had been 3 years since she had stepped foot in her family home, and now, at her father's request, she was finally returning. The message he had sent her was brief but unsettling. "I want to have a family meeting. Kane will be there." The name of her brother made her chest tighten. Kane, the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way, stealing not only her trust but also her husband, Michael. 3 years ago, she had walked away from them, severing all ties after their mother's passing. And yet, here she was, being pulled back into the tangled web of family matters. The taxi came to a stop in front of her childhood home, a grand Victorian house that had stood for nearly a century. It looked the same, dignified yet melancholic, as if it, too, carried the weight of the past. As Elizabeth stepped out, she noticed the garden, once meticulously cared for by her mother, now slightly overgrown but still holding traces of her mother's love. Taking a deep breath, she walked up to the door. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was different. The air felt charged, as if an unseen force was waiting to unfold. She glanced towards her father's study and noticed his desk neatly arranged, with stacks of documents and an open laptop displaying PDF files. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. "Glad you could make it," a familiar voice said. She turned to see her father standing in the doorway. His graying hair and kind gaze were unchanged, but today, there was something else in his expression, something resolute. Before she could ask anything, the sound of high heels echoed down the hallway. The front door swung open, and in walked Kane, draped in luxury from head to toe, followed by Michael, who carried the same arrogant air he always had. They sauntered in as if they owned the house, settling onto the large sofa as though this meeting was nothing more than a formality. Kane crossed his legs, his expensive watch glinting under the chandelier. "Father," he began smoothly, "I've consulted with some lawyers about the inheritance." Elizabeth stiffened. "So that's what this is about." Their father remained silent for a moment before slowly rising from his chair. "Perfect timing," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I have something important to discuss." The air in the room shifted. Kane's smug smile wavered, and Michael, sensing the change, straightened slightly. "I have terminal pancreatic cancer," their father stated plainly. 3 months to live." Silence. The room, which had been filled with an air of entitlement just moments before, now felt suffocating. Elizabeth swallowed hard, tears pricking at her eyes. She had known about his diagnosis, but hearing him say it aloud made it all the more real. Across from her, Kane and Michael's reactions were starkly different: shock, then panic, then calculation. Elizabeth saw it in their eyes. They weren't grieving a father, they were processing what this meant for them. "We'll take care of you," Kane rushed to say, his voice just a little too eager. "You can trust us." Michael nodded, forcing a professional tone. "I can arrange the best treatment for you." Their father held up a hand, silencing them. "That won't be necessary." Walking to his desk, he pulled out a thick envelope sealed by a notary. "I want you to see this." The rustling of paper was the only sound in the room as he spread out the documents before them. One by one, he laid out the evidence: unpaid notices from their mother's care facility, records of Cain embezzling the care funds, proof of Michael falsifying medical certificates, security camera footage, even their mother's handwritten diary entries pleading for their help. Elizabeth watched as the color drained from Cain's face, his once perfectly composed expression now cracking. Michael clenched his jaw, cold sweat forming on his brow. "You abandoned your mother," their father said, his voice quiet but heavy with grief. "And then you lived lavishly with the money meant for her care." The evidence was undeniable. There was nowhere to run. And then, their father took out the final document. "This is my will." Elizabeth saw Cain's fingers twitch. "All assets will be inherited by Elizabeth," their father declared. "With conditions for both of you." Cain shot up from his seat, his brand name bag slipping from his lap. "That's illegal. We have inheritance rights." Their father met his gaze unwaveringly. "Do you think you deserve such rights?" Michael paled. His medical career, his social status, everything could crumble if this information was released. "The evidence is already stored with multiple lawyers and prosecutors," their father said coldly. "You have two choices. Accept the conditions, or—" He didn't need to finish. The weight of his words spoke for itself. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Cain and Michael sat in stunned silence, their once carefully curated lives unraveling before them. 1 year had passed since the fateful family meeting. The echoes of that day still lingered in Elizabeth Wilson's mind. The revelations, the evidence, the shame etched onto Cain and Michael's faces as their father dismantled their lies piece by piece. But time had moved forward, and with it, the inevitable consequences of their actions. Cain and Michael, once the picture of wealth and success, had watched their carefully curated world collapse like a house of cards. The luxurious apartment they once flaunted on social media was now gone, foreclosed after months of missed mortgage payments. The glamorous lifestyle they had built on deception and stolen money was no longer sustainable. Without access to their father's inheritance, Cain's extravagant spending habits caught up with him. His once thriving real estate business began to decline, clients distancing themselves as whispers of his misdeeds spread. The social circle he had worked so hard to maintain, the elegant parties, the VIP events, the carefully cultivated friendships with high-status individuals vanished almost overnight. The people who once showered him with praise and admiration were nowhere to be found when his fortune dried up. Michael, too, faced his own reckoning. At Mount Auburn Hospital, rumors of his unethical medical practices began circulating. His colleagues, once envious of his position, now regarded him with disdain. Patients requested different doctors, avoiding him entirely. The hospital administration, under increasing scrutiny, transferred him to a small, understaffed clinic in the countryside, far from the prestige and luxury he had grown accustomed to. The glamorous photos on Cain's social media stopped. No more 5-star vacations in Europe, no more expensive dinners, no more brand new luxury cars. The carefully constructed illusion had crumbled. Their relationship, which had once thrived on shared arrogance and a mutual disregard for others, began to fracture. At first, they blamed Elizabeth for their downfall, cursing her name in hushed conversations. But soon, they turned on each other. "It's your fault we lost everything," Cain would snap. "You should have been more careful with the hospital records." Michael would fire back, "And you should have been smarter with the money. You blew it all on useless luxuries." Their once united front turned into bitter accusations, each trying to shift the blame. The resentment festered, and soon, their relationship disintegrated completely. They began living separately, their bond reduced to nothing more than mutual contempt. The last time Elizabeth saw them was at their mother's grave. As per their father's will, they were required to offer an apology, one final act of accountability for the lives they had destroyed. They arrived, looking nothing like their former selves. The arrogance was gone, replaced by hollow eyes and tired expressions. Their designer clothes no longer seemed fitting, their presence no longer commanding. Elizabeth watched them from a distance, feeling neither anger nor satisfaction. There was no triumph in their suffering, only the quiet weight of karma. As she turned away, she realized that she no longer carried the burden of their betrayal. The past had finally let her go. A year had passed since the storm of betrayal, revelations, and reckoning. The once chaotic Wilson household had found its peace again, and so had Elizabeth. She now lived in her childhood home, a place that no longer carried the weight of painful memories but instead blossomed with renewal and quiet strength. The first sign of change was the garden. The roses her mother had cherished, once neglected and overshadowed by years of turmoil, had begun to bloom again under Elizabeth's careful hands. Each morning, she would tend to them, pruning, watering, and nurturing them back to life. It wasn't just gardening, it was a way to heal, to preserve the love her mother had poured into this house. Inside the home, the atmosphere had transformed as well. The heavy silence that had once lingered in the wake of her father's passing was now filled with the gentle sounds of classical music. Air on the G-string, her mother's favorite, played softly from the living room, wrapping the house in a familiar warmth. It was as if her parents were still there, watching over her. Her professional life had flourished too. With years of dedication and unwavering compassion, Elizabeth had earned the trust of her colleagues and patients. Her hard work had not gone unnoticed. "Miss Wilson, congratulations on your promotion to head nurse." The words had taken her by surprise at first, but when she looked around the hospital, the place where she had devoted so much of her time and energy, she realized it was where she truly belonged. Her patients, her team, the young nurses who looked up to her, all of it made her feel whole. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. One afternoon, after finishing a long shift, she sat on the wooden bench in her garden, feeling the soft breeze of spring against her skin. She looked down at the ring on her finger, not the wedding ring that had once symbolized a broken promise, but her mother's keepsake ring, a symbol of the love that had never wavered. She thought about Kane and Michael. Their lives had unraveled completely. Kane's once glamorous world had faded into obscurity, and Michael's career had been reduced to irrelevance. Their downfall had been their own doing. But Elizabeth no longer felt bitterness toward them. She didn't need revenge or vindication. The life she had now was proof enough that she had won not through destruction, but through resilience. As she gazed up at the bright, endless sky, a small smile graced her lips. "Mom, Dad. I'm happy," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. And for the first time in years, she truly meant it.